Thank you, Josh. It'd be helpful if you have the book of Job open in front of you. We will be jumping around a little bit this morning, but if you have it open in front of you, that will help. Well, as I said, today we're beginning a short series looking at the book of Job. And we've begun by witnessing in these first 2 chapters of the book the kind of appalling suffering and strife that usually pulls in the biggest headlines and the most engagement of news reports today. I don't know if you've ever looked on the BBC News website and seen the top 10 articles. I reckon if you look right now, the top 5, there will definitely be at least 2 references to some kind of great suffering. It's just the way it is. We are captivated by pictures such as that we see in Job. As we reach the end of these 2 chapters, we're left with a man scraping his sores with a piece of pottery, sat in the ashes with a shaven head, whose very wife is encouraging him to curse God and die. It is harrowing and gripping. And then what follows is nearly 40 chapters of dense Hebrew poetry. And this isn't some AI-generated drivel either, right? The book of Job is a literary masterpiece. Let me give you some examples. It's very, very quotable. Man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. Or, a stupid man will get understanding when a wild donkey's colt is born a man. It's like when pigs will fly, but the Old Testament equivalent. Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. And then I really like this one, describing a wealthy man. I love this description. One dies in his full vigor, being wholly at ease and secure, his pails full of milk, and the marrow of his bones moist. Have you got moist bone marrow this morning? I hope you do. Is that I don't know. The book of Job has a great pull to it. People are fascinated by it. You'll even find people who have nothing to do with Christianity and want nothing to do with it. They will gravitate towards the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Job. But it's also a hugely intimidating book. It's really long. And there is actually a great degree of variance on how parts of it are interpreted. Well, my intention in this first sermon in our series is to draw out the big picture from this bewildering and yet fascinating book which God in his wisdom has given to us in his Holy Bible. And my basic contention is this: Job is not a book about suffering. It is a book about wisdom, taught through the context of extreme suffering. Job is not a book about suffering. It is a book about wisdom, taught through the context of extreme suffering. And I hope to prove that to you this morning, and we're going to look at the overall structure of the book of Job, and we'll see that this is the case, and we'll draw out some application from this remarkable book for us. So the first thing I will draw our attention to then are the narrative bookends. How many of you have ever fallen asleep during a TV program, woken up again, and realized you've got no idea what's going on? Anyone? Yes? Any of you try and read books at night before you go to bed, and then you're reading and you go, I've no idea what's going on here. Or the next day you pick it up and you think, yeah, there's no way I could comprehend what went on there, and you've got to go back again. Often there's some key piece of information or maybe a key character that you might miss out if you fall asleep. There's a key in there. And likewise, there is an interpretive key for the book of Job. Something that if we miss, we're going to get the whole thing wrong, or at least make it very, very difficult to grasp its message. And in the providence of God, it is the case that the part of the book which is easiest to read is where the interpretive key is found. It's found in the narrative bookends. The book begins with narrative, it ends with narrative, and there's a whole bunch of poetry in the middle. And we've read the first 2 chapters this morning. And in these chapters, we are given an insight into what is really going on. Which, as we go into the book, we realize that the characters in the book of Job have no idea what's going on, other than God, of course. So let's quickly look at this opening narrative and see what do we learn. Firstly, we learn that Job is a righteous man. Job chapter 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, what an aspiration, right? To be described as Job was described. Wouldn't that be a wonderful way to be described? And notice as well that the righteousness of Job is not wholly self-interested. You see, Job understands something that's very important. If we want to live righteous lives, then our relationships with those around us absolutely matter. Our horizontal relationships with other people in our lives are foundational or key as well to understanding our vertical relationship with God. If those aren't right, this isn't going to be right. Often, if you're having trouble with someone horizontally, you're having trouble vertically. That is the pattern of Scripture. But notice, Job, he is concerned for his children. And look at the way he deals with his children. They hold feasts. Each brother gets a day of the week to hold a feast. Sounds like quite a fun tradition. And then Job makes sacrifices for them in case, just in case, that they have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Job gets it. In fact, in a few weeks' time, we're going to look at what we can learn from Job in terms of our relationships as well. But firstly, we see Job is a righteous man. Secondly, and probably most importantly, we learn at least part of the reason why Job goes on to suffer as he does. We get to know why Job will suffer. Chapter 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. It's a court scene. God is there holding court with the sons of God, whoever they are. And Satan comes among them. Satan, that name literally means accuser. The accuser. So we've got this courtroom. The divine judge is God. The accuser comes forward. And the accuser's attention is drawn to Job, that righteous man. And the accuser accuses. And he accuses Job that he only loves God because he's got lots of material possessions. In verse 9 we see, Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The accuser is saying, why does Job love you? He's saying he only loves you because of the things that you have. And then come this terrible series of events, one after the other, so extreme as to be totally crushing. Is the accuser correct? Does Job only love God because of the things that he has? No. In verse 20 we read that Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshipped. And he says those incredible words, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And then, just to make sure we get it, in verse 22, in all this Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That's both things. He is both righteous, and we know why he suffered. Of course, he does not know why. And then the courtroom happens again. You get a repeat in chapter 2, and the accuser comes forward, and God draws the accuser's attention to Job. And he's saying, okay, fine. Job loved you, and it wasn't because of the things that he had, but he's healthy. If you take away his health, then he will curse you. And it's a terrible situation he finds himself in. Such is the magnitude of Job's suffering. Look at the way his friends respond. Verse 12. His friends come together, and when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. So severe is his suffering, they see him far off and they think, no, that can't be Job. Is the accuser proved right? Satan says, Job only loves you, God, because of what he gets out of it. Because of his wealth, because of his health. Is that true? Well, in verse 9, his wife says to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Okay, let's backtrack for a moment. Remember, I'm trying to show you that the book of Job is not a book about suffering. It's a book about wisdom taught through the context of extreme suffering. And in this narrative, we are given a perspective on what has happened and why, that then allows us to assess those who are going to come along and try to explain what has happened and giving their reasons for it. You see, we know at least part of the real reason why Job suffers. So that when we then read the poetry, which is full of people trying to explain why Job has experienced what he's experienced, we are able to say, no, they're falling short. We are given a superior perspective. To be very clear then, the narrative bookends show us that Job is righteous, and in the way he faces his suffering, he remains righteous. And the reason he suffers so badly is because the accuser wants to accuse Job, and really by extension all of humanity, of only loving God because of what we get out of him. That's what's actually going on. And it frames the speeches that are to come. I mean, imagine in the future, right? A child has to write a history report on what it was like to live through lockdown, right? And they didn't live through lockdown, let's say. And they bring it to you and they explain, oh, then this happened, and then they ran out of toilet paper, and then people were disinfecting their shoes and their shopping and all this stuff. They could explain it to you, but you, as someone who experienced it firsthand, you know whether they're right or wrong, don't you? You'd be able to say, yeah, no, that's not quite right. That's not what happened. You see, we're put in a similar situation in the book of Job. We are given the information that we need so that when these people come with their reasons and their explanations, we can say, that's right, that's wrong. Okay. Next up then comes in the book of Job, the great debate. Have you ever got stuck in an argument in which neither of you will back down? Which really is another way of asking, did you ever have an argument with me when I was 15 and I knew everything, right? Because I knew everything back then. I thought I did. I would not be convinced of anything other than the truth as I conceived of it. And God has been working on me to chisel off those argumentative edges. It still comes out sometimes. Well, when we look at the main chunk of the book of Job, from chapter 3 to chapter 37, it's evident that this is the sort of arguing that's going on. And it all begins with Job lamenting his situation. Even he curses the day of his birth. So hard has been his suffering. And then the friends, one at a time, take turns at trying to help Job understand why he's suffering and what he needs to do, rather than wasting his time lamenting. The basic premise is this: bad people suffer, Job is suffering, therefore Job must be bad. He must have done something bad. And so if he will only repent, he will no longer face such hard times. Eliphaz says as much in chapter 4 from verse 7. He says, remember, who was innocent that ever perished? Or where was the upright cut off? As I've seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish. By the blast of his anger they're consumed. The roar of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, the teeth of the young lions are broken. The strong lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lionesses are scattered. The way they use imagery is absolutely fascinating. But you can see there, Eliphaz's basic point is this: it's bad people who suffer. You're suffering. You must have done something wrong. and the other friends, they say much the same thing. But Job fights back. He says, hang on. I know I have done nothing wrong that deserves this suffering. And remember, we have the interpretive key to the book of Job. We already know that Job has been described as upright and blameless. So what the friends are saying is wrong. We are able to assess their wisdom and say, no, that falls short. Now look, some people do suffer because of some particular sin they've committed. That is taught in the Bible. Sometimes people suffer because God is wanting them to grow in some area. Thy dross to consume, we sang it in How Firm a Foundation. God lets us go through suffering sometimes that we might grow in faith. But that's not what's going on with Job. He's an upright and blameless man. There is no specific sin. There's no specific thing that God needs him to work on. He is suffering. But the friends will not be proven wrong. Job must have sinned. That's the only way they can understand the situation. And again, we have the key. We can interpret their interpretation and say, no, their wisdom falls short. Do you know, it gets really, really horrible. Later on, in chapter 22 and verse 5, we start to read how the friends are so determined to prove that Job has sinned that they start to make up things he must have done. Chapter 22, verse 5, is not your evil abundant, says Eliphaz to his friend. There is no end to your iniquities. For you have extracted pledges off your brothers for nothing. You've stripped the naked of their clothing. You've given no water to the weary to drink. You have withheld bread from the hungry. The man with power possessed the land, and the favored man lived in it. And you sent away widows empty, and the arms of the fatherless were crushed. What horrible things they say of their friend. And it's no wonder that at the end of the book, they are condemned for the things that they have said. So then, we know the friends, their wisdom falls short. Who is wise? Not Eliphaz, not Zophar, not Bildad. What about Job? Job does speak what is right about God. We are told that explicitly in chapter 42. But he also doesn't know what we know. He doesn't have the narrative bookends. He's not being given this vision of the courtroom of heaven to understand why he suffers. And so here is a man who clearly treasures his relationship with God. But he will not curse God despite all that he faces. And yet at the same time, he cannot understand why he suffers. He begins to despair, believing that God must be against him. And yet, right, even as Job voices that great fear that God has turned against him, it's clear he doesn't really think that's the case. Chapter 19 is one of Job's lowest moments, but also one of his highest. And these are perhaps some of the most famous words from the book of Job. Job 19, verse 21, have mercy on me, O you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why do you, like God, pursue me? He believes he's pursued by God. God is against him. Why are you not satisfied with my flesh? And then he says, oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. See, God feels far off to Job in his suffering. But he knows he will see God in the end. To see God is to be in relationship with God. No small part of the suffering of Job is this agonizing over his relationship with God, this apparent distance with God. Those of us who are believers, we know this, don't we? those times when we feel distant with God, there is an agony in that, which we very quickly try and repress. But it's there. When there's that distance from God, when we find we cannot pray, that's a hard thing. What do you do with that? Are you like Job? Do you remind yourself that at the end of the day, no matter how you feel in any given moment, you will see the Lord? That's where Job's hope is, in seeing God. And so we can say that, who is wise? Well, it's not the friends. We can say that Job is kind of wise, but he's lacking perspective. And so he has this wrestle, and he's struggling with who God is and his relationship with him. So his wisdom is limited because he lacks perspective. He doesn't know what we know from the narrative bookends. And then come the speeches from the whirlwind. Back in October, I was given a wonderful gift for my birthday. It was tickets to go and listen to Mahler's Second Symphony at the Barbican in London. Now, for most of you, that means almost nothing, right? Let me assure you, that's not a small thing. This is, I want you to envisage not just an orchestra, but a full to bursting orchestra, right? A full choir, 2 soloist singers, an organ, and then on top of that, Mahler's like, okay, I also want extra performers behind doors off stage so that music comes from all around the people who are listening. It's amazing. A totally overwhelming musical experience. And the finale is huge. It's an enormous piece, and it swells and it swells. In fact, the piece is titled Resurrection. And the climax, I think, comes close to doing that title justice. These huge chords, walls of sound that just crash upon you. I cried, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. The book of Job has a far more magnificent climax than Mahler's Second Symphony. There's a sentence you didn't expect. Because here at last comes a voice that speaks wisdom, which is full and true. Chapter 38 is where it begins. Verse 1, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, out of the whirlwind God speaks. And if by now we haven't got the point about the book of Job, here we are really confronted with it. You see, in the narrative bookends, we are given a superior perspective to Job and his friends. We are put in a position to say, are they wise or not? We can make judgments on the statements that they make. We're in the superior position. How wise are we? Then God comes along and speaks out of the whirlwind and makes very clear to us that yes, I may have let you have a bigger perspective for a while in this wonderful book of Job, but at this point, I'm going to make it very clear to Job and to you that your perspective is very, very, very small. The reality is, we are just like the characters in the book of Job. We have no idea what is really going on. After all, how often do we get a glimpse into the throne room of God and listen to his counsel? Now, there are some things that we can say, yes, we know what God is about, right? We know some decrees from the court of God. We know that what God is like, at least in part, that he is holy and just, that he is loving and merciful. We know that God's big plan, the big plan of the Bible from the very beginning, is that Jesus would come and that he would die and rise so that we can be saved by him. But in the everyday of life, and particularly in the storms, do we know why God sends what he does our way? Now, sometimes we might have an idea. As I've experienced suffering in my life, and there have been times when, yes, I've realized God is teaching me something about himself that I didn't realize before. Or sometimes, God is showing me a pattern of sin in my life that I need to address. But occasionally, Job-like suffering comes along, which we cannot understand and we have no answer for. We seek in prayer to understand, God, why are you letting me face this? And we just can't understand why. Who has the perspective to understand this. While Mahler blasts you with chord after chord in his symphony, God, out of the whirlwind, gives question after question. Job chapter 38, from verse 39. Can you hunt the prey for the lion? Or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens, or lie in wait in their thicket? Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth, when they crouch and bring forth their offspring and are delivered of their young? The young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go out and do not return to them. Who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift donkey, to whom I've given the arid plain for his home and the salt land for his dwelling place? He scorns the tumult of the city. He hears not the shouts of the driver. He ranges the mountains as his pasture and searches after every green thing. Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind him in the furrow with ropes, and will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you depend on him because his strength is great? And will you leave to him your labor? Do you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? These are magnificent questions that point us to the created beauty of this world. We're going to come back to this at the end of this series and look at these questions. But do you see what God is doing? God does not directly address Job's suffering in these speeches from the whirlwind. What God does do is reveal just how great his perspective is. The question of the book of Job is, who is wise? The answer is God alone, who is over and above all. God lets us think that we're wise for a little bit in Job. And then he humbles us and reminds us how it really is. God sees all. For us to be wise is to recognize that wisdom begins with God. Wisdom is taking what is true about God and acting accordingly. The Bible calls that the fear of the Lord. So do you see, Job is not merely about suffering. As great a topic as it is in this book, Job is about something bigger than suffering. It's about wisdom. Wisdom which shows you the right path to walk in life, which understands how things really are. Let us see then that this book puts us in the place of wisdom over the friends and then humbles us under the wisdom of God. Right, so what? I've got two things I want to put across to you. First thing is this, right? This should be plain already. One, our perspective is small. As we've already said, Job confronts us with just how small our perspective is and the danger that that puts us in. After all, look at the friends. They're not thick. They're clever people. They say a lot of things that are true about God. But their perspective is too small for them to be making the kinds of statements that they are. Let's take this truth, that our perspective is small. We might feel we know much, can interpret much from a single sentence that someone speaks, or when we see the way they wash their car. I don't know. You get people who can interpret all kinds of things from what people do. But actually our perspective is very small. Let us be humble. Now, what might that look like in our lives? Well, firstly, in the realm of world events, when I worked at the pub, I used to hear this all the time, right? People who speak as if they know exactly what is going on, right? That if you go to a pub, you will discover all of the answers to all of the problems in the world. It's amazing. They're so wise, right? I hear Christians do this as well. Speaking as if we know exactly what's going on. Yeah, God's let Trump do this because this is going to happen. There are passages which help us and can understand what's going on in the world around us. Key example. When a culture turns its back on God and suppresses the truth about him, Paul teaches us in Romans that that culture will be marked by sexual immorality as God gives it over to its base and sinful desires. Why is our country the way that it is? Actually, in part, we can give an answer. Because they've rejected the truth about God. But we can become quite bold and brash in our statements. This is not all of us. This is only some of us. God's going to let this happen until this happens. Or we've got it all mapped out, exactly how it's going to happen. This person is going to achieve this. This person is direct fulfillment of this biblical prophecy. Let us cultivate hearts which are rightly curious about why God allows things to happen, but which humbly recognizes that our perspective is small. Secondly, as we see suffering in the lives of others, let's not jump to conclusions about them and the reasons of the reasons behind their suffering. The book of Job should teach us. Again, these clever men, they know so much about God, but they lack wisdom because they don't recognize their lack of perspective and that God has it all. The kind of speculation about why someone's suffering the way that they are, it often comes about through gossip. Did you hear about so-and-so? They've been diagnosed with this. Oh, well, I'd heard that they'd been doing this or that. I don't hear it often, but I do hear it. Let's not let that sort of thing be heard among us. Let's be wise to our own small perspective. Perhaps, yes, we can gain insight into each other's lives, but let's be humble, and let's certainly not let gossip be the means by which we interpret the suffering of others. And thirdly, as we face suffering, we may be granted understanding. There may be suffering that comes your way, and you can see, God's teaching me this about himself, or God's showing me this in myself. And we know, we do have certainties. We know that God always works for the good of his people. And sometimes that has to be enough. As we walk wisely in suffering, we need to recognize our perspective is just too small and simply cling to the God who is far greater than we are. And sometimes that's it. Does not Job show us that wisdom of clinging to God? Secondly and finally, what is it that we need? This book is about wisdom. What wisdom does it give us on what we need to know, particularly in suffering? But really, at all times, in order to be wise, what do we need to know? Well, remember, the friends give long, sometimes complicated, and also sometimes brutally short analyses of Job's situation and what he should do. And none of it brings an end to Job's wrestling. Job doesn't go, he hears a friend and goes, oh, that's it. I understand now. There's no nice and neat conclusion, so some right formation of words which could subdue his feeling of his suffering. What Job needed, what brings an end to the agonizing of Job, is not his friend's theories, it's theology. The truth about God. That's what God dishes up for him. A magnificent revelation of his superior perspective and power. We've not had time to look at it all, but chapters 38 through 41, it's this awesome presentation of theology for us. And sometimes we come across people who are suffering and we feel a great pressure to say something profound. Right? Oh, I'm going to go and see this person. They've been really struggling with this. You know, I want to have just the right word for their situation. And so often that paralyzes us from saying anything at all. Because very rarely is there just a short sentence that you could say that would really help someone. Let's learn from the wisdom of the book of Job. What does God give Job in his suffering? What's the thing that he needed? What's the thing that your friends, your family need when they're suffering and struggling? Can't understand why something has happened. They don't need your theory. They need theology. They need the truth about God. That's what Job needed to hear. Paul tells Timothy to be ready in season and out of season. Let's be like that by ensuring that each of us is pursuing God. And then, when we come across that person who is struggling, sometimes and often, the best thing we can give them is not, I think this verse will really help you. It's, here's what God has been teaching me about himself. Not just a theory, not cold theology, but what God has been teaching you, how God's been working that out in you. That's what Job needed. That's what sufferers need, the truth about God. So let's not be paralyzed into thinking we need to have a perfect answer to every problem. Let's instead share our faith with each other as we see each other suffering. Let's share theology. Does not the book of Job at the very least teach us that that is what those who are struggling need? The book of Job asks the question, who is wise? Through its structure, we see it's not the friends, it's not even Job, though he does do well. It is the Lord who is wise. And if we would be wise, we should live in light of who he is. That means fear the Lord. May God grant us the grace to do so. Let's pray.